Pacific doesn't care about the size of your bank account or the prestige of your family name. It was 3 a.m. off the coast of the Aleutians, and the North Pacific was currently trying to swallow $20 million of Vane marine hardware. The deck of the Vane Challenger was a screaming symphony of industrial failure. Red strobe lights cut through the freezing salt spray, and the emergency siren was a physical weight against the eardrums. The Eager 7 submersible was dangling by a single frayed high-tensile tether, swinging like a giant's pendulum against the steel hull. One more rogue wave, one more slip of the primary winch, and the pride of the Vane fleet would vanish into the black abyss. "Get away from that console." Isabella Vane's voice cracked over the roar of the gale. She stepped into the strobe light, her face a mask of panic disguised as cold authority. She pointed a shaking finger at the man standing by the manual override. "I told you to stay back. You're a deckhand, Elias, a grease monkey. If you touch that override again, I'll have you blacklisted from every port from here to Singapore. I dare you." Elias Thorne didn't flinch. He stood perfectly still, his eyes locked on the pressure transducer readout, watching the needles skip rhythmically across the red zone. He wasn't breathing hard. He was calculating. "We'll have exactly 45 seconds before the internal seal fails and the vacuum collapses," Elias said, his voice a low, terrifying calm that bypassed the wind. He finally turned, his gaze as cold as the water below. "Choose how you want to spend them." What Elias saw in that moment, the microscopic vibration in the secondary housing, was the secret 20 world-class engineers had missed, and it was a secret that was about to cost Isabella Vane everything. The 38th floor of Vane Marine Systems HQ didn't feel like a place where ships were built. It felt like a place where they were willed into existence by sheer financial gravity. The air was clinical, filtered to a sterile perfection that carried the faint, expansive scent of ozone and white lilies. Floor-to-ceiling glass overlooked the harbor, making the massive cargo ships below look like children's toys, insignificant and dirty compared to the high-tech sanctuary of the boardroom. Isabella Vane stood at the head of a mahogany table that could have easily doubled as a small aircraft carrier. She was draped in a tailored charcoal suit that cost more than the average deckhand made in a year. Her hair was pulled back into a knot so tight it seemed to sharpen her features into a blade. She was a creature of legacy, a woman who believed that the Marine in her company's name was merely a brand, not a reality of salt, rust, and blood. "The Vane X1 deep-sea sensor isn't just a tool," Isabella said, her voice smooth and practiced as she gestured toward a holographic display of a titanium-housed device. The stone-faced investors watched as the blue light bathed her face. "It is the end of manual intervention. For a century, this industry has been held hostage by the human element, by men who rely on intuition, luck, and brute force. We have replaced the grease with code. We have replaced the wrench with the algorithm." In the back corner of the room, hidden behind a decorative marble pillar, Elias Thorne was on his knees. He was a stark, jarring contrast to the room's clinical perfection. He wore a faded canvas jacket with oil stains that had become a permanent part of the fabric. His hands were thick, his knuckles scarred and calloused, currently gripped around a specialized wrench as he worked on a small hydraulic junction that fed the room's climate control system. He was a temp contractor brought in for a weekend, repair a man who wasn't supposed to be seen, and certainly wasn't supposed to speak. Isabella's eyes flickered toward him, a flash of predatory instinct. She saw an opportunity to solidify her point. She stepped away from the hologram, pointing a manicured hand toward Elias. "Look at this man," she said, her voice dripping with a calculated, polite disdain. The investors turned their heads as one. Elias didn't look up. He kept his focus on the copper threading of the valve. "Mr. Thorne here represents the old world. He is the physical embodiment of the inefficiency we are eliminating. He carries the smell of diesel and the weight of antique tools. He is honest. Labor, certainly, but he is a relic. He is the grease-stained hand that used to hold the industry back. In my world, we don't need mechanics, we need architects." A few of the investors chuckled a low, dry sound. Elias felt the heat of their gaze, but he remained stoic. He had heard it all before from people who had never felt the terrifying pressure of 1,000 atmospheres against a failing hull. Elias tightened the valve, the metal singing under his touch. He stood up slowly, wiping his hands on a rag that was barely cleaner than the floor. He looked at the holographic display of the Vane X1. He saw it immediately. He saw the secret Isabella's engineers hadn't accounted for because they lived in CAD programs, not the current. "The housing is grade 5 titanium, isn't it?" Elias's voice was low, rasping slightly. The room went dead silent. Isabella froze, her smile faltering. "Excuse me," she said, her tone sharpening. Elias stepped forward, just enough to be in the light. "The Vane X1. You've used a standard grade 5 alloy for the main pressure cylinder. It looks good on paper, but you've got a 90-degree intersection at the sensor port with no stress relief filleting." Isabella laughed, a sharp, dismissive sound. "I appreciate the input from the maintenance department, but this sensor was designed by a team of PhDs from MIT. I think they understand stress points better than a man who fixes air conditioning." The PhDs aren't the ones who have to listen to the whole groan when the temperature drops to 2 degrees Celsius, Elias said, his eyes steady. At that depth, grade 5 becomes brittle under cyclical loading. If you hit a thermal vent, the housing won't just leak, it'll shatter. You have a microscopic flaw in the intergranular structure of that batch. I can see it in the spectral density of your own data. Isabella stepped toward him, her heels clicking like gunshots on the marble. The mockery was gone, replaced by a cold, concentrated fury. Elias had dared to challenge the one thing she valued more than her money, her image as a visionary. "You are a relic of a dead era, Elias," she hissed, low enough that only he could hear the full venom. Then, she raised her voice for the board. "Mr. Thorne, thank you for the lecture. I'll be sure to tell HR that your services are no longer required at this building, or any other under the Vane umbrella. You've spent too long looking at rust to recognize the future. Security will see you out. Try not to leave any grease." On the door, Elias looked at her for a long moment. He didn't argue, he didn't beg. He simply picked up his worn tool bag, the leather handle familiar and honest against his palm. He walked toward the exit, the silence of the room a physical weight against his back. He knew Isabella Vane had just made a mistake worth millions. He just didn't realize yet that the price of that mistake would be measured in lives, including his own. The bus ride back to the East District took 40 minutes and felt like 40 years. Elias sat near the back, his tool bag between his boots, watching the city skyline shift from the glittering glass spires of the Vane Empire to the gray, salt-eroded brick of the docks. He didn't think about the humiliation Isabella Vane had tried to heap on him. He didn't think about being fired. He thought about the numbers. $12,000. And that was the gap. The apartment on 4th Street was on the 3rd floor, situated directly above a bakery that smelled of burnt sugar and old yeast. It was a cramped space, hardly more than 400 square feet, but it was meticulously, almost militarily, clean. Elias had spent a decade in the claustrophobic confines of saturation chambers and deep-sea habitats. He knew that in a small space disorder was a safety hazard dot as he turned the key in the deadbolt. He was greeted not by words, but by a sound. It was a high-pitched electronic whistle, a thin needle of feedback that pierced the quiet of the hallway. "Mia," Elias called out, setting his bag down by the door. A 7-year-old girl with eyes the color of a shallow reef looked up from the kitchen table. Her hair was pulled back into messy pigtails, and she was hunched over a drawing of a giant squid. Attached to her left ear was a bulky, flesh-colored plastic device, a hearing aid that had been state-of-the-art in 2012 but was now a relic of failing circuitry. A strip of white surgical tape was wrapped around the battery housing to keep it from rattling, and a smear of blue putty tried to seal the ill-fitting mold. "Hi, Dad," she said, her voice carrying the slightly flat cadence of the profoundly deaf. She reached up and adjusted the mold, and the whistling finally died down. Elias walked over and kissed the top of her head. He felt a familiar, sharp ache in his chest, a pressure no decompression chamber could ever bleed off. "How was school?" "Good," she said, looking back at her drawing. "The teacher says I need to pay attention more. But I told her the batteries were buzzing. They make a sound, like bees." Elias knelt beside her, his large, scarred hands looking out of place against her small shoulders. He reached out and gently touched the taped-up device. He had been a master diver and a lead structural engineer for the deepest oil rigs in the Gulf. He had managed life support systems for crews living at 70 atmospheres of pressure. He was a man who could calculate the crush depth of a reinforced hull in his sleep. Yet he couldn't afford the $12,000 cochlear upgrade that would give his daughter a world without bees. Isabella Vane spent that much on a single bottle of wine for her board meetings. To Elias, it was the silent burden he carried through 3 different jobs: contract maintenance, night security, and dockside salvage. He had treated the high-risk, high-pay world of elite deep-sea engineering for this life of quiet struggle because he had made a promise. He looked toward the small bookshelf in the corner. Tucked between a technical manual on hydraulic systems and a child's book about whales was a framed photograph. It was a woman with Mia's eyes, standing on the deck of a research vessel, the wind whipping her hair across a brilliant smile. Sarah, the mystery trigger that haunted the waterfront, wasn't just why an elite engineer like Elias Thorne was working as a temp mechanic. It was about the mission that cost him his career and his wife. 7 years ago, the Centurion incident had been scrubbed from the official records, a deep-sea habitat failure, a rescue mission that shouldn't have been possible. Elias had made it out with a baby in his arms, but the woman in the photo had remained in the black. Elias never talked about it. He had walked away from the glory and the lawsuits, taking Mia and disappearing into the anonymous life of a dock worker. He didn't want the fame. He wanted a life where his daughter didn't have to grow up wondering if her father would come back. From the bottom of the sea, Mia reached into a pocket and pulled out a small, heavy object. She set it on the table next to a drawing. It was a vintage brass diving compass, the metal worn smooth by decades of use. It had been Sarah's lucky needle, she had called it. "I took it to show and tell," Mia whispered, her fingers tracing the glass face. The boys said it was broken because it doesn't have a screen like a phone. They said it's just a piece of old junk. Elias picked up the compass. The brass was cold, a physical link to a past he tried to outrun every single day. He watched the needle tremor, searching for magnetic north, oblivious to the sterile high-tech world outside these walls. "They're wrong, Mia," Elias said, his voice deep and steady. He placed the compass in her hand and closed her fingers over it. "Technology is just noise. It's fancy screens and expensive code that can break when the power goes out. But this," he tapped the brass casing. "This is physics. This is truth." He looked at the tape on her hearing aid, then out the window toward the harbor, where the vane towers loomed like predatory birds. "The deeper you go in life, Mia, the more the world tries to confuse you. The pressure gets heavy and people start shouting, telling you which way is up. But you have to remember one thing." He looked her in the eyes, his stoicism a shield for her to stand behind. "You have to trust the needle, not the noise. Always." Mia nodded, tucking the compass back into her pocket as if it were a holy relic. She didn't know that her father was currently blacklisted. She didn't know that the $12,000 felt further away than ever. Elias stood up and walked to the kitchen, his mind already working. He didn't need Isabella Vane's respect. He didn't need her world. But he knew the ocean, and he knew the floor he had seen in the Van X1. It wasn't a guess. It was a certainty. Somewhere out there, in the cold, dark water, the noise was about to stop, and Isabella Vane was going to find out just how much her relic of a dead era was truly worth. Elias opened the refrigerator. There was half a gallon of milk, 3 eggs, and a jar of cheap peanut butter. He closed the door and checked the handwritten schedule pinned to the front. 5 a.m. Wake up. 5:30 a.m. Mia's breakfast. 6:30 a.m. Dockside maintenance. 6 p.m. Night shift at the salvage yard. He didn't have time for pride. He only had time for the work. But as he looked at his scarred knuckles, he knew one thing for sure. When the pressure hit the Vane X1, the ocean wouldn't care about Isabella's MIT degree. It would only care about the truth. And Elias Thorne was the only man left who knew how to find it. The Vane Challenger felt less like a ship and more like a floating tomb for Isabella's ambition. They were 3 days into the sea trails of the Vane X1, and the atmosphere on the bridge was thick with the copper temps of ozone and the heavy, humid heat of failing electronics. Isabella Vane stood in the center of a circle of workstations, her arms crossed so tightly her knuckles were white. Ahead of her, a massive LED wall displayed a live feed from the winch camera, dark, grainy, with a view of the Pacific floor. Next to it, a graph showed the data stream from the sensor. It was a flat line. "Explain it again, Dr. Sterling," Isabella said, her voice a dangerous low-frequency hum. "And this time, try to use words that don't sound like an excuse for why my $20 million project is currently a very expensive paperweight." Dr. Sterling, a man with 3 degrees and a nervous twitch in his left eye, wiped sweat from his forehead. "We don't understand it, Ms. Vane. The bench tests were perfect. The pressure chamber at HQ showed 500 bars without a single drop in signal. But every time we hit the 4,000-meter mark, the handshake fails. The signal attenuation just spikes. We're losing 60 decibels of gain in under 3 seconds. We've checked the software architecture 6 times. The code is clean. Then it's the hardware," Isabella snapped. "Check the tether. Check the junction box." "We have," Sterling whispered. "Everything is green." In the shadow of the port side bulkhead, Elias Thorne was on his knees. He wasn't part of the elite engineering team. He had been brought on as a low-level maintenance contractor the grease monkey Isabella had mocked in the boardroom. His job was to clean the hydraulic residue off the deck plates and ensure the manual winches were greased. He was currently holding a bucket of solvent and a heavy-duty scrub brush, but his eyes weren't on the steel floor. They were fixed on a discarded schematic of the Vane X1's internal housing that had been taped to the bulkhead. Elias didn't need a CAD program. He was running the math in the quiet, disciplined space behind his eyes, the space where he had spent 10 years calculating the difference between a successful dive and a watery grave. Hydrostatic pressure, 400 atmospheres. Dielectric oil bath. Temperature, 2 degrees Celsius. Titanium grade 5 thermal expansion coefficient, 8.6 He saw it. It wasn't in the code. It was in the physics. It was the secret Elias saw that 20 engineers missed. Isabella turned, her eyes scanning the room, for someone to vent her mounting fury upon. She caught Elias staring at the schematic. A cold, mocking smile touched her lips. She saw an opportunity to remind everyone on the bridge who the relic was. "Still looking for a miracle in the blueprints, Elias?" she called out, her voice cutting through the hum of the cooling fans. The engineers all turned grateful for the distraction from their own failure. "Or are you just looking for a reason to keep your job? I thought I told you to keep the deck clean, not the airwaves." Elias stood up slowly. He wiped his hands on his canvas trousers. He didn't look offended. He looked focused. "It's not the software, Ms. Vane," Elias said. The bridge went quiet. Dr. Sterling looked like he wanted to crawl into the ballast. Tank starts. Isabella stepped toward him, her heels clicking with predatory rhythm. Oh, the deckhand has a theory. Please, enlighten the PhD's Elias. Tell us why the Vanex 1 is failing. Elias stepped toward the schematic, pointing a scarred finger at the sensor's internal core. You're fighting the refractive index of the dielectric oil bath, Elias said, his voice carrying a calm authority that made Dr. Sterling flinch. You used a synthetic ester for the internal insulation because it has a high dielectric constant, right? On paper, it's perfect. But at 4,000 meters, the hydrostatic pressure is hitting 400 bars. That pressure is shifting the molecular density of the oil, which in turn shifts the refractive index just enough to cause a focal point misalignment on the internal laser diode. Isabella's smile faltered, but she didn't stop. The diode is housed in a pressure balance chamber. The physics are sound. The physics are sound, Elias countered, but the material science isn't. You've got a differential thermal expansion problem. The grade 5 titanium housing is contracting at a different rate than the quartz lens assembly. At that depth, the temperature drops to 2 degrees. The housing is pinching the lens, creating a microscopic distortion, a microcavitation bubble. In the oil, the piezoelectric crystals aren't losing their signal. They're being hit by a harmonic resonance caused by the bubble. It's not a software handshake failure. It's a physical occlusion. You're trying to broadcast a laser through a prism that's being crushed into a different shape. The bridge was so silent you could hear the salt spray hitting the windows. Dr. Sterling leaned in, his eyes darting between Elias and the monitors. He began tapping at his keyboard, his fingers moving with frantic speed. Wait, Sterling whispered. Refractive index shifted 400 bars. Focal misalignment. Ms. Vane, he might be right. If the density of the ester shifts by even 0.02%, the laser would miss the receiver by 3 microns. Isabella felt the heat rise in her neck. She was the visionary. She was the one who had replaced the wrench with the algorithm. And here was a man who smelled of diesel, explaining to her why her algorithm was useless against the cold. Hard reality of the deep Dutch. She saw the investors' faces in her mind. She saw the "Try me again, I dare you" headlines if she failed. It's a guess, Isabella said, her voice trembling with suppressed rage. A lucky guess from a man who spent too long in the dark. We don't need intuition here, Elias. We need data. She reached out and snatched a specialized diagnostic tablet from Dr. Sterling's hand. She turned to Elias, holding it out like a challenge. If you're so smart, she hissed. If you're such a master of the deep, then prove it. Try me again. Dare you. Use the bypass protocols. Fix the focal alignment from the bridge if you can do it. I'll double your contract. Elias reached out for the tablet. His fingers had just brushed the edge of the screen when Isabella jerked it back. She laughed, a sharp, bitter sound. But I forgot, she said, her eyes flashing with cruelty. You don't have the security clearance. You're a relic. Remember, I'm not putting the future of Vane Marine in the hands of a man who still uses a brass compass to find his way home. She turned her back on him, dismissing him like a stray dog. Dr. Sternly ignored a deckhand. Rerun the simulation. Include the signal gain until it punches through the occlusion. I want that sensor working by dawn. Elias Thorne didn't argue. He didn't show the anger that was simmering beneath his ribs. He simply picked up his bucket and his brush. Increasing the gain will only increase the harmonic resonance, Ms. Vane, Elias said quietly as he walked away. You won't just lose the signal, you'll shatter the lens. Isabella didn't look back. She didn't see the look of absolute certainty in Elias's eyes. She didn't see him reach into his pocket and touch the brass diving compass Mia had given him. He knew the truth. And the truth was about to hit Isabella Vane with a weight of 400 atmospheres. And this time, there wouldn't be a deckhand around to scrub the blood off the deck. The deck of the Vane Challenger had been transformed into a billion-dollar theater. Isabella Vane didn't just want to prove the Vane X1 worked. She wanted to stage an industrial coronation. Under the glare of high-intensity halogen floods that fought back the encroaching North Pacific fog, 6 of the world's most powerful venture capitalists stood in a set. They were men who wore $5,000 waterproof parkas and held crystal flutes of vintage champagne, their eyes fixed on a 60-inch tactical display. Isabella stood at the center, a digital tablet in her hand like a scepter. She looked radiant, the adrenaline of the moment sharpening her features into a mask of triumph. Gentlemen, she said, her voice amplified by the ship's PA system. Today we don't just reach the bottom, we own it. The Aegis 7 is currently passing the 3,000-meter mark. At 4,000, the Vanex 1 will activate, providing the first real-time high-definition spectroscopic analysis of the volcanic vents. No lag, no signal loss, total clarity. Elias Thorne was 50 feet away, standing in the shadows of the secondary winch housing. He wasn't invited to the party. He was holding a grease gun, tasked with the unskilled labor of maintaining the backup cables. He looked at the sky. The clouds were heavy, the color of a fresh bruise, and the wind was picking up a sharp, biting gale that carried the scent of deep-water ice. He looked at the tactical display. The depth counter was ticking, upward 3,850, 3,900. 3,950. Asterisk Elias knew. He could feel it in the way the ship rolled, the subtle change in the tension of the primary tether. The ocean was starting to lean on the sub. Depth 4,000 meters, Dr. Sterling announced from the bridge, his voice cracking with a mixture of excitement and terror. Activating Vane X1. Handshake initiated. On the big screen, the grainy winch feed was supposed to be replaced by the crystal-clear output of the sensor. Instead, the screen flickered. A jagged line of static tore across the blue interface. The signal stuttered, a digital heart attack in real. Handshake failed. Sterling's voice dropped an octave. We have a parity error. Signal attenuation is spiking. Minus 40 decibels. Minus 50. Isabella's smile didn't just fade. It vanished. She tapped her tablet frantically. Sterling, what are you doing? Reset the buffer. Punch through it. I'm trying, Ms. Vane. It's not a software glitch. The focal alignment it's shifting. The receiver isn't seeing the diode. Isabella's gaze whipped toward Elias for a split second. She looked like she might scream. Then, she saw the investors whispering, their flutes of champagne slowing. Her legacy was hemorrhaging value with every second of static. Elias stepped. Out of the shadows, he dropped the grease gun. It hit the steel deck with a heavy clang that cut through the wind. He walked toward the bridge, his boots heavy and deliberate. Isabella, Elias said, his voice a low, steady rumble that cut through her panic. Stop. You're hitting the thermal transition. Their grade 5 housing is contracting, lenses being pinched. Isabella turned on him, her eyes wild. Get back to the winch, Elias. I didn't ask for a diagnosis from the help. Refractive indexes shifted. Elias was at the bridge door now, his hand on the frame. If you try to force the signal, now, you'll create a feedback loop in the piezoelectric array. The harmonic resonance will shatter the quartz lens. You'll flood the sub. It's a $20 million sub, Isabella screamed, her voice reaching a pitch that made the investors recoil. It doesn't shatter because a deckhand says so. Sterling, ignore him. Override the safety protocols. Increase the signal gain to 150%. Now, Dr. Sterling hesitated, his hand hovering over the red override toggle. Ms. Vane, Thorne might be right about the focal shift. I am the CEO of Vane Marine, she roared, stepping into Sterling's space. I am the daughter of the man who built this fleet. Do as I say, or you can join Thorne on the unemployment line tomorrow morning. Sterling's face went pale. He hit the toggle. On the monitors, the gain meter spiked into the purple. A sound began to emanate from the sub's audio telemetry, a high, thin shriek, like a tea kettle at the gates of hell. It was the sound of titanium and quartz screaming under a pressure they weren't designed to survive. Gain at one, Sterling whispered. Signal it's coming through. I see the vents. For 5 seconds, Isabella looked like a god. The screen cleared. The volcanic vents appeared in stunning, terrifying detail. She turned to the investors, her chin high. You see, it just needed a little more. Then the shriek stopped. It was replaced by a sound Elias knew in his marrow. A crack. It wasn't loud, but it was final. The screen went black. Not static, just black. Total signal loss. Sterling gasped. The sub. We've lost internal pressure sensors. The winch is showing a sudden weight drop. The $20 million submersible hadn't just failed. It was falling. The tether snapped. Isabella stared at the black screen, her mouth hanging open. The preventable disaster had arrived, and it was wearing her signature. Elias moved toward the console, his hand reaching for the emergency acoustic ping. Well, if we don't trigger the emergency ballast blow now, the sub will hit crush depth in 3 minutes. We can still save the hull. Isabella didn't move. She didn't see a sub in trouble. She saw her father's face. She saw the lawsuits. And then, she saw Elias Thorne, the man who had been right. Her panic turned into a blind, incandescent rage. She didn't want to save the sub. She wanted to erase the man who had predicted her failure. Get him off the bridge, Isabella screamed, pointing at Elias. Security, get this man off my ship. He's sabotaging the equipment. He's blacklisted. I want him in the hold. 2 large security guards in Vane Marine tactical gear stepped forward. They grabbed Elias by the arms. Elias didn't fight them. He knew that if he fought, the distraction would kill any remaining chance Sterling had. Isabella, listen to me, Elias shouted as they dragged him toward the door. The sub is still under a vacuum seal. If you try to reel in the snapped line, the friction will spark the dielectric oil. You're finished, Thorne, Isabella spat, her face inches from his as the guards hauled him out into the freezing rain. You're a nothing, a ghost. Get off my ship and never show your face in this industry again. The guards threw him onto the wet deck. Elias hit the steel hard, the rain instantly soaking through his canvas jacket. He looked up. A young technician, a kid named Leo who couldn't have been older than 22, was standing by the door, his eyes wide with terror. He was the one Isabella had left in charge of the winch monitors. Elias stood up, his gaze locking onto the kid. The guards moved to push him further back, but Elias didn't move. "Leo," Elias said, his voice cutting through the downpour like a knife. The kid flinched. I have to follow orders, Mr. Thorne." "Listen to me," Elias whispered, ignoring the guard's hand on his shoulder. "The secret you're about to see is the one they chose to ignore. Look at the secondary telemetry light. The small one under the winch tensioner." Leo looked. "When that light turns amber," Elias said, his voice deathly quiet, "it means the internal vacuum seal is gone. The sub is imploding. When that happens, you have exactly 10 seconds to cut the line before the winch rips the back off this ship. 10 seconds, Leo. Don't look at her. Look at the light." Elias turned away. He didn't wait for a response. He walked toward the railing, his head down against the ran. He didn't need to stay to hear the explosion. He didn't need to see Isabella. Vane realized her "try me again" challenge had just sunk her empire. He had a daughter at home with a broken hearing aid and a brass compass. He had a life that didn't need Isabella's permission to exist. As he disappeared into the fog of the lower deck, the siren on the bridge began to change its tone. Behind him, on the winch console, a small, secondary light flickered. It turned amber and the countdown began. The North Pacific does not offer refunds, and it does not accept apologies. The disaster wasn't a sudden explosion. It was a sequence of inevitable physics that Isabella Vane's money couldn't bribe. When the Eagle 7 hit 4,100 meters, the focal lens didn't just crack, it shattered into a billion microscopic shards of quartz, which were instantly driven through the piezoelectric array by the weight of the ocean. The vacuum seal failed. The dielectric oil ignited under the sudden friction of the winch rip, and $20 million of high-tech ambition became a mangled knot of titanium at the bottom of the abyss. By dawn, the investors were gone. They didn't even stay for breakfast. They left their crystal flutes on the deck and their signatures on withdrawal notices. Isabella Vane, the heiress who had replaced the wrench with the algorithm, was now the woman who had presided over the most expansive technical failure in the history of deep-sea exploration. Her experts, led by a trembling Dr. Sterling, admitted they couldn't even locate the wreckage, let alone recover the black box data that could prove the failure wasn't due to gross negligence. Isabella was ruined. Not just financially, her name was a radioactive brand in every port from Seattle to Tokyo. She had one chance to save the company from bankruptcy. She had to recover the sensor data, and there was only one man who had predicted the failure, mode with enough precision to know where the debris had drifted. She didn't find Elias Thorne at a high-end engineering firm. She found him in the East District Community Health Center. The clinic was a stark, jarring reality compared to the Vane boardroom. It smelled of industrial floor wax, cheap coffee, and the weary desperation of people who live their lives in the margins. The fluorescent lights flickered with a low-frequency hum that made Isabella's teeth ache. She walked through the crowded waiting room, her tailored charcoal suit looking like a foreign uniform among the faded denim and work jackets. People stared. She didn't care. She scanned the room until she saw him. Elias was sitting in a cracked plastic chair in the corner. He wasn't looking at a tablet or a schematic. He was looking at his daughter, Mia. The girl was sitting next to him, her head resting on his shoulder. Her old hearing aid was sitting on a paper towel on Elias's lap, disassembled into its tiny, pathetic components. Elias was using a pair of jeweler's tweezers to move a microscopic wire. Isabella stopped in front of him. The shadow of her presence fell over his work. "Elias," he said. Her voice sounded thin, stripped of the manufactured authority it usually carried. Elias didn't look up. He didn't even pause his hand. "You're blocking the light, Ms. Vane." Isabella felt a surge of her old habit, an urge to snap, to command. But she looked at the room, at the peeling paint on the walls, and then at the broken device in his hand. She swallowed her pride. It tasted like ash. "The Heiress 7 is gone," she whispered. "The investors pulled out. The board is moving to liquidate. Sterling says the current at that depth would have carried the wreckage 3 miles into the trench. We can't find it." Elias carefully set the tweezers down. He finally looked up. His eyes weren't filled with the "I told you so" satisfaction Isabella expected. They were just tired, flat, like the surface of the deep water before a storm. "The current didn't carry it 3 miles, Elias said. The density shift in the oil bath created a drag coefficient that would have anchored the hull against the shelf at 4,200. It's sitting on a ledge, less than 500 yards from the deployment point. But you won't find it with a sensor. You'll have to find it with your ears." Isabella leaned in, her eyes wide. "Tell me. Come back to the ship. I'll double your contract. Triple it. I'll give you a title. Technical consultant, anything you want." Elias looked at her for a long beat. Then he looked at the plastic chair next to him. "Sit down, Isabella." Isabella blinked. "I don't have time to sit down," Elias repeated, his voice a low rumble. That brooked no argument or walk out. "My daughter has an appointment in 10 minutes. I'm not leaving until the doctor checks her mold." Isabella Vane, the woman whose family name was etched into the steel of 100 ships, lowered herself into the cracked plastic chair. It felt cold, it felt small. She sat in silence while the minutes ticked by on a buzzing wall clock. She sat while a woman across the room coughed and a toddler cried. For the first time in her life, she wasn't a CEO. She was just a person waiting for a turn that wasn't guaranteed. Finally, a nurse called Mia's name. Elias stood up, gathered the pieces of the hearing aid and walked Mia to the door. Isabella started to stand, but Elias held up a hand. Wait here. He was gone for 20 minutes. When he returned, he sat back down. Mia was holding a small sticker of a cartoon fish, looking slightly more at peace. I don't want your triple pay, Isabella, Elias said, his voice level. And I don't want a title. Titles are just noise. Then what? Isabella asked, her voice desperate. I'll pay whatever the recovery fee is. Elias pulled a folded piece of paper from his pocket. It wasn't a bill. It was a handwritten document, dense with his disciplined, technical script. This is the price, Elias said. First, you sign a personal, legally binding guarantee for the Vane Marine Safety and Education Fund. It will provide full medical and technical training for every dock worker and deckhand in the East District. No more grease monkeys being used as props. Isabella nodded quickly. Done. What else? Second, Elias said, his gaze shifting to Mia, who was tracing the brass compass in her lap. A full, non-revocable scholarship for Mia, top-tier education, and a surgery for her cochlear implants, the best specialists in the country, private care. No more tape on the battery housing. No more whistling. Isabella looked at the little girl. She saw the brass compass. She saw the quiet strength Elias had built around her, a shield made of calluses and silence. I'll sign it, Isabella said. Right now. There's one more thing, Elias added, his eyes narrowing. When we get back on that bridge, you don't talk. You don't command, you listen. When I tell you the needle is moving, you trust the needle, not the algorithm, not the PhDs, me. Isabella looked at the man she had called a relic of a dead era. She realized then that she wasn't hiring a mechanic. She was asking a master of a forgotten world to save her from the one she had built. I understand, she said. Elias stood up. He picked up his worn tool bag. He looked at Mia and touched her pigtailed hair. Wait with Mrs. Gable at the bakery? Okay. I have to go finish a job. Are you going to find the secret, Dad? Mia asked. Her voice flat but hopeful. Elias looked at Isabella, then back at his daughter. No, Mia. I'm going to show them that the secret was there all along. They just had too much noise to see it. He walked out of the clinic, his stride heavy and purposeful. Isabella followed 3 steps behind, no longer leading, but finally, for the first time in her life, following the man who knew the way home. The bridge of the Vane Challenger felt like a funeral parlor until Elias Thorne stepped through the door. The high-priced engineers were huddled around the main console, staring at a screen full of static and system error codes. Dr. Sterling looked up, his face ashen. It's gone, Elias. The primary bus is fried. There's no way to trigger a remote recovery. Elias didn't go to the main console. He went to the auxiliary workbench in the corner. He reached into his tool bag and pulled out a handful of scavenged parts. A copper induction coil from an old winch motor, a set of high-frequency capacitors he'd pulled from a discarded radio, and a soldering iron. What are you doing? Isabella whispered from the back of the room. She looked small, her authority stripped away by the silence of her sensors. I'm not using your bus, Elias said, his hands moving with a terrifying rhythmic precision. The titanium housing is acting as a Faraday cage. I'm going to use the tether's internal steel core to create a low-frequency acoustic pulse. I'm building a bootleg impedance matcher. The bridge was silent as Elias worked. It was 90 seconds of pure, concentrated mastery. He bypassed the multi-million-dollar software layers entirely, stripping the system back to the raw physics of sound and vibration. He sorted a final connection, clipped a lead to the winch cable, and flipped a toggle. A screen flickered. A line of green text began to scroll. *SYNCING ... Data stream established. Packet recovery, 100%. * The lost sensor data poured onto the monitors, a perfect high-definition record of the failure and the volcanic vent coordinates. It was a miracle built from junk. Mr. Henderson, the lead investor, stepped forward. He ignored Isabella entirely, his eyes fixed on Elias. I've spent 40 years in this industry, Henderson said, his voice thick with respect. I've never seen anyone read the water like that. He turned to the other board members. Isabella, your algorithm nearly cost us $1 billion discovery. This man saved it with a soldering iron. As of this moment, the board is exercising the contingency clause. You're stepping down. Elias Thorne is the new technical director of Vane Marine. Isabella stood in the back of the room, quiet, ignored, and finally humbled as the crowd moved toward Elias. And Elias, Henderson added, sliding a digital tablet toward him. That recovery was outside the scope of your contract. Consider that a $500,000 performance bonus. Pay for your daughter's doctor, and then let's build some real ships. The sun was setting over the harbor, painting the water in strokes of gold. Elias stood on the salt-worn pier with Mia, who was finally still. No more flinching from electronic static or buzzing bees. Attached to her ear was a device so small, it was almost invisible, the finest engineering money could buy. She looked out at the rolling Pacific, the vast world her father had mastered. "It's so quiet now, Dad," she whispered. Her voice was clear, the flat cadence of her struggle finally. "Go, I can hear the waves, I can hear you." Elias smiled. It was a real, unguarded smile that reached his eyes, finally breaking the stoic armor he had worn for years. Asterisk narrator. In a world that screams for attention, the loudest voice in the room is rarely the most powerful. True strength doesn't need to dare anyone. It just needs to be there, steady and true, when the pressure hits, because at the bottom of the ocean, and at the heart of a home, only the truth survives the crush.